Picture this. It's 1926. A truck driver has already logged 14 hours behind the wheel. There's no radio, no heater, just a wooden bench seat and a windshield that barely keeps out the wind. The sun is gone. He's out of road. He can safely drive. He pulls off onto the shoulder, climbs down from the cab, and walks to the back of the truck. There's a narrow wooden hatch bolted to the frame. He opens it and folds himself inside. No window. No light. Just enough space to lie down, and not enough to turn over. Drivers had a name for this box. They called it the coffin. And here's the question almost nobody has properly answered. If this box was as bad as it sounds, why did thousands of men climb into one every single night by choice? The answer isn't what you'd think, and it's the reason every truck on the highway today has a bed built into it. This story has three parts. First, why the road left drivers with literally no good options. Second, what a night inside the coffin actually felt like, because summer and winter were two completely different kinds of miserable. Third, the real reason drivers didn't just tolerate these boxes, they fought to keep them. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the modern sleeper cab exists, and why it took 30 years to build. In the early 1920s, the American road network was barely a network at all. Most long-haul routes were dirt, gravel, or half-paved at best. A trip that takes 6 hours today could easily eat up 2 or 3 days, and there was no rulebook. Hours of service regulations didn't exist yet. That wouldn't happen until the mid-1930s. A trucking company could push a driver as far as his body would allow, and most drivers pushed themselves even further because pay depended on miles, not hours. It's worth pausing on just how fast this problem grew. In 1919, there were roughly 1 million trucks registered in the entire United States. By 1930, that number had more than tripled. The industry expanded faster than anyone could build the infrastructure to support it. Roads came first, rest came last. Nobody sat down and planned where these men were supposed to sleep, because nobody planning the freight boom was thinking about the driver at the end of the route. They were thinking about the cargo. That gap between what the industry demanded and what it provided is really the entire story in miniature. Freight was booming. Factories needed parts moved. Farms needed produce hauled before it spoiled. Every mile a truck sat parked was money nobody was making. So the pressure wasn't just coming from the company, it was coming from the driver's own pocket. A man who stopped to rest properly was a man who fell behind the next driver on the same route. So picture the actual conditions. A man alone, on a machine with no suspension to speak of, on roads that turned to mud in the rain, driving farther than anyone had driven by truck before, with absolutely nowhere designed for him to rest. So what did he actually do? There were 3 options on the table, and every one of them fell apart under real conditions. Option 1. Sleep sitting up in the cab. The seat was a flat wooden bench, no recline, no padding worth mentioning. A grown man couldn't lie down in it if he tried. Drivers would jam a rolled coat behind their neck, lean into the corner of the door, and try to steal an hour or two like that. You'd wake up with your spine locked in a shape it was never built to hold, and then climb straight back behind the wheel. Do that for a week straight, and the damage stops being temporary. Backs gave out early. Necks froze at odd angles that never fully corrected. Drivers in their 30s move like men twice their age. Option 2. Sleep on the ground. Pull over, throw down a bedroll under the trailer, and hope for the best. In summer, that meant mosquitoes, humidity, and rain soaking through canvas by 3 in the morning. In winter, it meant waking up frozen to the dirt, with nothing between you and the open sky. And there was another problem nobody talks about: exposure. A man asleep on open ground beside a loaded truck was an easy target for wildlife in some regions, and for opportunistic thieves in others. Sleeping outside meant sleeping with one ear open, which defeats the entire purpose of sleeping. Option 3. Find a room somewhere. Roadside motels were only just starting to appear, and they were built with cars in mind, not an 18-foot truck with a trailer. Half the time there was nothing for 50 miles. And even when a driver found a room, he had to leave his rig and his cargo, sitting alone all night. Theft was common enough that drivers dreaded it more than the cold. Insurance on cargo losses was rare and expensive, so a stolen shipment could cost a driver his job, or worse, come directly out of his own pocket. 3 options. None of them worked. So by the mid-1920s, drivers stopped waiting for someone else to solve this. They built their own answer, and it's one of the most overlooked inventions in American trucking history. Drivers started bolting small wooden compartments directly onto the truck frame, behind the cab, underneath it, sometimes built right into the nose of the trailer. Scrap lumber, sheet metal, whatever was on hand. There was no blueprint for this. Every driver essentially designed his own version, learning from whichever trucker had built one before him at the last stop. Inside, a thin mattress, sometimes a folded blanket, and nothing else. Roughly 2 feet wide, 2 feet high, 6 feet long, just enough room for one man to lie flat, with no space left over to roll to his other side. Some had no door connecting to the cab at all. To get in, a driver had to stop the truck, climb down, walk around back, and crawl in feet first through a hatch cut into the frame. Other designs used the space where a rear window had been, so a driver would squeeze through head first and drop down onto the mattress below. They named it after exactly what it looked like: a coffin. There's also a quieter detail buried in this story that rarely gets mentioned. Some drivers personalized their coffins the way people personalize any small space they spend real time in. A photograph wedged into a corner, a name carved into the wood by the door. Small, useless comforts that did nothing to fix the heat or the cold, but made the box feel like it belonged to someone, rather than just being a hole a man crawled into out of desperation. It's a small thing, but it says something about how these drivers related to an object most people today would call unbearable. They didn't just endure it in a strange way, many of them made it theirs. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that historians rely on to reconstruct what daily life on the road actually felt like, rather than just what the official record says about it. So the obvious question is, why would anyone choose this? To understand that, you need to actually feel what a night inside one was like, and that's where this story really turns. Let's put you inside it. Summer, August, somewhere along a Texas back road, 1927. You've been driving since dawn. The truck's been sitting in direct sun all day, and every bit of that heat has soaked into the metal and wood of the box on the back. By the time you finally stop at 10 at night, you're running on fumes. You climb down, walk around, open the hatch. The air that hits you is thick and stale, hotter than the air outside, because the box has been sealed shut since sunrise. No vent, no window. Whatever air was trapped in there when the door shut is the air you're about to breathe all night. You crawl in feet first, lie down flat. You can't sit up. You can't roll over without your shoulder hitting the wall. Within minutes, you're sweating through your shirt, and there's nothing you can do about it. No fan, no airflow, just thin gaps around the door frame letting in dust and the occasional mosquito along with whatever breeze happens to pass by. Eventually, exhaustion wins and you fall asleep anyway. Not because it got more comfortable, because your body simply gave out. Morning comes and the box is barely cooled. You climb out, soaked through, stiff in every joint, and within the hour you're back behind the wheel for another full day. Now flip the season. Winter, January, somewhere in Pennsylvania, 1928. Same driver, opposite problem. The engine's been off for hours. You're under one thin blanket. The walls have zero insulation, and the same metal frame that trapped heat in summer now pulls the cold straight through, fast and without mercy. By 3 in the morning, the inside of that box is nearly as cold as the world outside it. You've got 2 choices: get up, walk to the cab, restart the engine, and wait for warmth to creep back, or stay put and wait for sunrise. Most men stayed put, because getting up meant leaving the one blanket that was working. And here's the part drivers almost never talked about out loud. The versions of the coffin mounted low, close to the road surface, often had no sealed floor. Road dust worked its way up through the gaps. So did engine exhaust. And exhaust means carbon monoxide, odorless, invisible, and in a sealed wooden box with no ventilation, capable of putting a man to sleep and simply not letting him wake up. Drivers knew this. They talked about it the way people talk about a risk they've already accepted, flatly, without much drama. It was part of the job. The road took a few of them. Most kept sleeping in the coffin anyway. Historians who study early trucking often point out that this improvised period, messy and dangerous as it was, taught the entire industry a lesson it couldn't have learned any other way. That driver welfare wasn't a side detail to freight logistics. It was the foundation the whole system depended on. Which brings us to the part of this story that flips everything you'd expect. After everything you just heard, the heat, the cold, the carbon monoxide, a box named after where you get buried, you'd assume drivers hated these things and dropped them the second something better came along. That's not what happened. Many drivers preferred the coffin over every other option they'd ever had. Not because it was comfortable, because of what it gave them that nothing else could: control. With a coffin bolted to your truck, you never had to hunt for a boarding house. You never had to burn 2 extra hours looking for a room, and you never had to hand your cargo over to an empty parking lot overnight. You pulled over the second you were tired, not when the next town happened to show up, not when a motel had a vacancy. Right there, wherever you were. Before any hours of service laws existed, that mattered more than people realize today. A driver with a coffin sleeper could rest the moment his body demanded it, instead of gambling with exhaustion until the next available option appeared. The box wasn't luxury. It was the first time these men had ever been given a choice. A driver who owned his own rest schedule could plan a route around his own limits, instead of the limits of whatever town happened to be nearby. That single shift in control is easy to overlook today, but at the time it was closer to a small revolution in how the job worked. Some historians go further, arguing that without this improvised generation of self-built sleeping compartments, manufacturers would have had far less real-world data on what long-haul drivers actually needed, and the modern sleeper cab might have arrived a decade later than it did. It's easy, looking back with modern eyes, to see the coffin as nothing but a symbol of neglect, proof that nobody cared about these drivers. But that reading misses the more interesting truth. The coffin wasn't handed down by a company that didn't care. It was built by the drivers themselves, out of necessity, using whatever materials they had access to at the time. In that sense, it wasn't a symbol of neglect at all. It was a symbol of drivers refusing to accept the neglect and solving the problem on their own terms, long before anyone else was willing to. And that choice is exactly what manufacturers eventually couldn't ignore. By the late 1920s, truck makers were hearing the same demand from drivers all over the country. Build us somewhere real to sleep. In 1933, Kenworth became the first manufacturer to offer a sleeper section built directly into the truck at the factory. Basic, still open to the cab but structurally sound, and no longer something a driver had to bolt on himself. It was a modest change on paper, but it marked the first time an entire industry admitted that rest belonged in the original design, not bolted on as an afterthought by the driver himself. By 1947, Kenworth had gone further, with a fully enclosed sleeping compartment sealed off from the cab, safer in a crash, more private, and for the first time, practical for 2 driver teams to actually swap shifts on the road. Team driving had existed informally before this, but without a real enclosed berth, the resting driver was still exposed to noise, cold, and constant vibration. The enclosed compartment changed that overnight. By 1953, Freightliner introduced the overhead sleeper, a bunk built above the front seats, designed specifically to meet strict length regulations of the era without sacrificing rest. Regulators were capping total vehicle length around this time, so manufacturers had to find rest space without stretching the truck further. Building upward instead of outward solved that problem elegantly. Even then, those factory bunks were only about 2 feet wide, barely bigger than the scrapwood coffins drivers had been welding together themselves 2 decades earlier. But the difference wasn't size. It was that these were engineered, ventilated, crash-rated, built by people who'd finally accepted that rest wasn't optional. It was part of the job. A driver who crawled into a homemade coffin in 1926 with 1 blanket and exhaust creeping through the floorboards, and lived long enough to climb into a 1953 Freightliner overhead bunk, didn't just get a better night's sleep. He got something the road had never given him before. Today's sleeper cabs have climate control, real mattresses, storage, sometimes more livable space than a small studio apartment. But every bit of comfort in that space traces back to a driver in the 1920s who looked at his options, decided none of them were good enough, and built a wooden box with his own hands instead. The modern sleeper cab didn't come from an engineer's design table. It came from the side of a dirt road, from a man who decided a box barely wider than his own shoulders, with no light, no air, and no guarantee he'd wake up, was still better than everything else the road was offering him. It still does that, in its own quiet way, now.